Somewhere behind that jagged mask and that shrieking, unhinged laugh is a man who has spent nearly 50 years being one of the most soft-spoken, generous, and quietly beloved figures in the entire industry. Willem Dafoe has terrified children for 2 generations without ever raising his voice off camera. And the story of how he actually became Norman Osborn, the story he's told in his own words across dozens of interviews, is stranger and more revealing than the character himself. To understand it, though, you have to go back decades before Spider-Man ever crossed his desk. Willem James Dafoe was born on July 22, 1955, and grew up with a surname most people still can't pronounce correctly on the first try, a French-Swiss name he eventually simplified so it would flow better once he actually started working. The first name stuck around by accident, too, a nickname a high school friend gave him that he simply never bothered to drop. He enrolled in a college acting program and dropped out of it almost immediately, drawn instead toward the experimental fringes of the art form, the kind of work being done by groups like Grotowski and Robert Wilson that he'd only read about. That pull led him to New York in his early 20s, where he kept finding himself downtown at loft performances and dance pieces instead of anywhere resembling a traditional stage, until he landed with a company called the Wooster Group and stayed there for the next 27 years. It became his entire day-to-day existence, and it shaped a philosophy about acting that he still repeats to this day. He isn't interested in doing a job so much as helping an artist accomplish what they need to accomplish, standing behind the camera's true author and simply becoming their instrument. He's described it, memorably, as being a color in the canvas, and he means it as praise for the role, not a diminishment of it. His first credited film role came with a catch attached. Heaven's Gate needed what the production vaguely called ethnic faces, and Dafoe, prepping an audition monologue, had a friend phonetically write out a speech in Dutch, since the casting call required a second language, and he assumed nobody would check too closely. Nobody did, until director Michael Cimino asked him to improvise a scene, and then casually said, "And now do it in Dutch," at which point Dafoe had to admit he didn't actually speak a word of it. He stayed on anyway, buried somewhere in the background as one of the film's cockfighters, until a lighting setup delay left him standing around long enough for someone to tell him a joke. Cimino heard him at the wrong moment, turned around, and simply said, "Willem, step out." That was the entire firing, delivered in 4 words, and Dafoe has said ever since that he barely counts Heaven's Gate as his real first movie because of it. The role that actually launched things came a couple of years later, when Catherine Bigelow spotted him performing at the Wooster Group and asked if he wanted to make a movie with her and her co-director, Monty Montgomery. The Loveless needed a leather-jacketed biker gang leader who could handle a vintage Harley, and Dafoe, young enough and hungry enough not to admit any weakness, simply lied and said he already knew how to ride one. He didn't. He spent the days before filming checking motorcycle manuals out of the library, trying to memorize the shift pattern from a diagram, and then showed up to a quiet Connecticut neighborhood, climbed onto a meticulously restored 1955 Harley-Davidson, and immediately lost control of it through someone's backyard. The crew figured out his secret almost instantly. They were patient with him anyway, and by the time the cameras rolled, he'd actually learned to ride. Platoon arrived not long after, and Oliver Stone's approach to casting it was unusual even by Dafoe's standards. The director told him he had a part in the film without telling him which one, deciding the specific roles only after he'd assembled the actors he wanted. Preparation involved being flown into the jungles of the Philippines for a genuinely rough, semi-improvised military training period, stripped of agents and phone calls, digging perimeters, and playing at soldiering with instructors who took the exercise completely seriously, even though it was, technically, still pretend. Dafoe arrived to find the production briefly shut down entirely by a real political revolution unfolding around them, and he's described spending several surreal days out in the streets among the Filipino people during that upheaval, an experience made stranger by how peaceful it largely was. Once filming resumed, he said that rawness from the jungle training rooted the entire film in something real, even if the actors could never fully know what actual combat felt like. It wasn't all grim discipline either. He's told the story of a day the cast decided to smoke marijuana before shooting a scene meant to depict exactly that, only for the setup to take so long that everyone had completely sobered up, exhausted and irritable by the time the cameras finally rolled, leaving them to fake an entire scene about being high while feeling nothing but tired. The film's most iconic image, his character's death scene, arms raised toward the sky, earned Dafoe his first Academy Award nomination, though he's said that filming it felt more like rehearsing his own death than performing a scene. Simple and enormous at the same time, and that he still feels a genuine chill watching it back decades later. That nomination eventually put him in front of Martin Scorsese, who'd spent years trying to get The Last Temptation of Christ made, and finally called Dafoe directly to offer him the role after most of Hollywood had already auditioned for it without him. He said yes almost instantly, and has described shooting it in Morocco, stripped of modern distractions, as one of the most powerful experiences of his career, a film whose intention felt purely spiritual to him, even as it detonated into one of the decade's biggest religious controversies. He's recalled leaving his house during the height of the backlash and having a stranger on a stoop recognize him instantly, warning him he was in a lot of trouble for messing with the story, a moment Dafoe still finds oddly funny in hindsight, since messing with the familiar version of a story was precisely the point. David Lynch gave him one of his most purely enjoyable sets a couple of years later on Wild at Heart, handing him a costume on a hanger with almost no discussion and sending him straight to a dentist to get a set of grotesque false teeth built for the character of Bobby Peru. Dafoe has said he assumed they'd fake the character's bad teeth with simple makeup until Lynch insisted on real dentures, ones so awkward they physically wouldn't let him close his mouth properly, forcing an entirely new, leering physicality out of him that he hadn't planned for or even imagined on the page. He calls it proof that actors sometimes limit themselves without realizing it, and Bobby Peru remains, in his own estimation, one of the most complete characters he's ever built. Then came the strange, scrappy passion project that turned into a genuine phenomenon, almost by accident. Troy Duffy, a bartender who'd simply decided he could write better movies than the ones he was watching, produced a script for The Boondock Saints that ignited a real bidding war, before collapsing into years of casting disputes and a shrunken, minor theatrical release. Dafoe signed on as Detective Paul Smecker, an eccentric, classical music-loving investigator, drawn purely to Duffy's obvious hunger as a first-time filmmaker rather than any guarantee of success. Tracking Dafoe down at a theater performance he clearly didn't fully understand, but showed up for anyway out of sheer enthusiasm. Against every normal business model, the film found its audience anyway. Word of mouth turning it into a cult favorite so devoted that Dafoe says he can spot a Boondock Saints fan on the street before they even open their mouth, just from the way they approach him, usually men of a certain age who immediately want to talk about Smecker specifically. His second Oscar nomination arrived with Shadow of the Vampire, playing an actor so committed to portraying a vampire that the production begins to suspect he might actually be one, a performance built almost entirely underneath a punishing 3 hours on, 3 hours off makeup process that took him further from himself physically than almost any role before it. Dafoe has described the experience as strangely liberating rather than confining, since working from imitation, copying the physicality of the original silent film Nosferatu actor, freed him to be playful and strange in ways a blank page never could have, connecting him to a kind of boyish joy in performance he says only shows up when a role takes him somewhere entirely outside his own skin. None of that, though, quite prepared audiences for what came next, and it's the role most people now associate with him more than any other. When Sony and Sam Raimi began casting Spider-Man, Dafoe wanted the part of Norman Osborn badly enough to fight for it while he was thousands of miles away filming something else in Spain, arranging for a casting director to fly out and shoot his screen test inside his own hotel room. Not everyone around him understood the appeal. He's said plainly that some friends openly snubbed the decision, treating a comic book movie like a step down for a serious stage actor. And he's just as plainly said he never agreed with them, sensing something genuinely new in the material at a moment when movies built from comic books still weren't considered a normal thing to do, when the entire superhero genre was still languishing somewhere between the Dolph Lundgren Punisher and Lou Ferrigno's Hulk, a genre nobody yet trusted with serious source material or serious actors. Raimi handed him a copy of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde before filming even started, wanting Dafoe to build the entire performance around the duality of a fundamentally decent man slowly losing every argument with the monster he'd accidentally created inside himself. The now famous mirror scene, where Osborn and the Goblin persona argue back and forth across their own reflection, was shot in a single continuous take, Dafoe essentially dancing with the camera to keep the reflection convincing, switching voice, posture, and register mid-sentence with nothing but subtle shifts, a slightly arched eyebrow, a lowered register, a barely noticeable extension of the neck, to signal exactly who was in control at any given moment. He said the technical demands of that scene, timing his own physical performance to a mirror trick that could easily have looked campy in less careful hands, were exactly the kind of puzzle he finds genuinely fun to solve rather than frustrating, and it shows. Watching the scene now, there's never a moment where the illusion feels like a trick, rather than two entirely separate people occupying the same body. It's worth remembering, too, that over a decade earlier, Tim Burton's team had actually considered Dafoe for the Joker in Batman, struck by a physical resemblance to the character that, in hindsight, feels almost like a rehearsal for the role he'd eventually play instead. He's joked since that people still stop him on the street to say he'd have made a perfect Joker, a strange kind of compliment for a role he never actually got to play, and one that only underscores how much of Norman Osborn's menace came from Dafoe's own face and instincts, rather than the 4 inches of rigid plastic mask he spent most of the film acting through as the Goblin. The film's emotional high point, Norman Osborn's dying, broken plea not to be taken over again by the persona he can no longer control, remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in any superhero film, and it's built entirely on Dafoe's ability to make audiences believe, for one full sentence, that a father was still fighting somewhere underneath the monster, before the voice shifts mid-breath and the monster answers instead. He's carried that same appetite for reinvention into one of the more unusual creative partnerships of his career, working with Wes Anderson across nearly a decade of increasingly stylized films, a relationship that began simply because Dafoe wanted to meet him and arranged an introduction through mutual friends after seeing him at a Wooster Group show. The two got along well enough that Anderson mentioned he'd love to work together someday, though he was about to leave for Italy to shoot a fully cast film of his own. A few months later, that call came anyway. Someone had dropped out, and Anderson wanted him for a small, oddball role as a German sailor in The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. Dafoe has said with genuine affection that he never asked who he was replacing or why, just accepted the strange gift of it, and what started as a favor grew into a recurring collaboration spanning the Grand Budapest Hotel, Isle of Dogs, The French Dispatch, and Asteroid City, each performance built out of entirely different physical and emotional textures despite sharing the same meticulous directorial hand. He's described Anderson's sets as feeling closer to theater than film, long, complicated master shots rehearsed for hours and then captured in a handful of takes, with Anderson often folding him into scenes on the spot that weren't even planned that morning, turning to him mid-shoot and simply asking if he wanted to be in this one too. Not every collaboration was so playful. Working with Lars von Trier on Antichrist meant confronting some of the most extreme, unflinching material of his career, a film about grief, guilt, and mental illness that Dafoe has called one of his favorite experiences, precisely because of how fearlessly it examined subjects most films avoid entirely. Years later, Sean Baker's The Florida Project pulled him in the opposite direction entirely, casting him alongside mostly non-professional actors as a weary, endlessly patient motel manager, a performance built on doing rather than showing that earned him a 3rd Oscar nomination and, by his own account, some of the most personally meaningful work of his life. A 4th nomination followed for At Eternity's Gate, playing Vincent van Gogh for his friend, the painter-turned-director Julian Schnabel, a role that required Dafoe to genuinely learn to paint on camera himself rather than fake it with a stunt double, immersing him so completely in the process that he said he felt fully alive making it. 4 Academy Award nominations across nearly 4 decades, and not a single win. A fact fans have never stopped pointing out with genuine frustration on his behalf, especially after his physically punishing, verbally acrobatic performance opposite Robert Pattinson in Robert Eggers's The Lighthouse, a film Dafoe took almost entirely on instinct after Eggers pitched it to him in a single sentence: the two of them or nothing at all. He's called it a rare chance to perform with genuinely elevated, archaic language, singing sea shanties and howling into gale winds with the kind of physical abandon most actors half his age would struggle to sustain. Still practicing yoga after 25 years, and still, by every account from people who've worked with him, one of the warmest, least pretentious people on any set he walks onto. That contrast, the shrieking, sadistic menace on screen, and the quiet, generous collaborator everyone describes off it, might be the single most consistent thread running through Willem Dafoe's entire career. He said he was afraid of typecasting early on, worried that playing villains too often would deaden the craft of it, turn it into pride rather than genuine curiosity. And he spent decades actively refusing to let that happen, bouncing from Jesus to a vampire, to a struggling motel manager, to a lighthouse keeper, without ever settling into one comfortable lane. He doesn't dwell on any of it for long once it's finished either, saying simply that he relaxes for a bit and then goes looking for the next mission, the next family of collaborators, the next thing worth making. It's a strange kind of restlessness for a man closing in on 70, and it might be exactly why audiences who grew up terrified of Norman Osborn now find themselves, decades later, genuinely rooting for the soft-spoken, unfailingly curious man who played him. So here's the real question worth sitting with. After nearly 50 years of transforming into everything from a snarling supervillain to a suffering saint, without ever losing the plain-spoken, humble man underneath all of it, do you think Hollywood has simply run out of ways to properly reward an actor who refuses to play the fame game the way everyone else does? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this look behind the mask changed the way you see Norman Osborn, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.